It's the Hero Show. Welcome to the Hero Show, everybody. Starring the undaunted John Hersey and the irrepressible Andrew Bernstein. I am Andrew Bernstein, and you are indubitably John Hersey. How you doing this morning, John?
Fantastic. Pretty nice day out, and there's a whole bunch of people deciding to mow their lawns and whatnot. So I apologize for any background noise you might pick up on me. How are you doing today?
Well, I don't hear the background noise, to tell you the truth. Hopefully the audience doesn't either. But to answer your question, I am doing very well. Still here in sunny Florida, where the sun's not shining right now. Actually, a good thing, right? It keeps the terrible heat in this place in June to a bearable, degree. But I'll be back in New York for our next episode. But for today, I'm excited about the subject of the Hero Show today, right? The little giant, Edward H. Harriman.
Little giant, and he certainly was a giant, and apparently he was a small of stature, but incredible man that I really didn't know much about before you proposed that we cover him on the Hero Show. And you, of course, wrote about him in your great book, Capitalist Manifesto. I've got right here.
Yeah, I just happen to have a copy here, but just by accident, Sean. But a quote from it. But thank you. Yeah, turn of the 20th century, Harriman was recognized he was at the same level of entrepreneur, businessman as and capitalist as giants like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, whom we've discussed on the Hero Show, J.P. Morgan, who we will discuss. Harriman was at that same level. It's interesting, John, because these others have been vilified as the robber barons, and that's how for many people that's how they're known today. Whereas Harriman has suffered a war, which is a terrible injustice for these great producers to be vilified as robber barons. But Harriman has suffered an even worse fate. He's been largely forgotten, and that's a terrible injustice. And we're gonna do what we can to remediate that problem. We'll do what we can to make sure that people remember Edward H. Harriman.
Yeah, and there have been some books written about him, but not too many. In fact, it was hard to do some research for him. But what I did find out about his childhood is that at 14, he decided to drop out of school and go work as a message boy on the New York Stock Exchange, and he worked his way up.
By the way, how many we've noted this before? How many people who went on to great things did not like school or finish school or do well in school? There's a whole leitmotif that runs through a lot of our heroes. I should point out before you continue that Harriman's dates were 1848 to 1909. So people know we're late 19th century. What I dubbed in the Capitalist Manifesto, what I dubbed as the inventive period, and Harriman is a big part of that. But I'm sorry, John, you were talking about his childhood.
Absolutely, yeah. It's funny how many of these heroes that we talk about. You might think that we were promoting the idea that you should drop out of school or something, but I don't think that's
today that's not such a bad idea.
Yeah, perhaps today, but for certain professions, you absolutely need to get an advanced degree of some type. Like, you want to practice medicine, you're probably not going to be very effective in that without advanced education. But anyway, Harriman
and Tom has got his education from Alfred Blaylock, right? Not at medical school, as we discussed on the Hero Show. But I get your point. So, but I'm
rare
sorry,
opportunity,
yeah. I won't interrupt you again.
No, interrupt away. And in the years after, so this inventive period, years after the Civil War and before the turn of the century, there were the big industries today that we think about are all in tech, right? We think about the big companies like Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon. Well, then the fortunes to be made were in banking, railroads, telecom, as we've talked about before with Edison and company, George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla. And Harriman was one of these rare guys that actually had a hand in both. I guess Carnegie was too. He had his hands in steel and oil and probably some other things. real estate. And but Harriman started in banking, and yeah, he went to become a message boy on the New York Stock Exchange at the age of 14. Quit school to go do that, worked his way up, became a managing clerk, and not too long. I'm not sure exactly when he was promoted. And then when he was 21, 22 years old, he becomes a full-fledged member of the New York Stock Exchange. And his early career is spent in banking, right? So, until his late 30s, that's most of what he's doing. I mean, when he's what was it, early 30s, he gets interested in railroads, right?
Yes. Yes. I mean, Harriman, I guess Harriman's greatest achievements were with the railroads, and then that's certainly what he was known for. What he was known for primarily back then, like we said, he's unfortunately been largely forgotten today.
Yeah.
But was it in 1896? I think he was a success on Wall Street, but in 1896, I think he acquired the Union Pacific Railroad, right? I think it was in the late 1890s, certainly.
Yeah, and when he was 33 in 1881, so even before this, he buys the Lake Ontario Southern Railroad, and it was this like 34-mile railroad. During this time, right after the Civil War, there were hundreds of different railroad companies that had very short lines. You could only go 50 or 100 miles at most on a railroad, and they're pretty poorly maintained. So you didn't have yet a lot of these companies that were to come that would consolidate and build these massive empires, these railroad empires.
And J.P. Morgan did a lot of that.
He helped, yeah. But in 1881, when he's 33, he buys this very small railroad and revitalizes it, and he ends up selling it to the Pennsylvania Railroad for a profit. As well, he's still in banking, so he's sort of just doing this on the side. Revitalizes this railroad, and that opens up the opportunity. A couple of years later, in 1883, he's invited to become the director of the Illinois Central, and he's dedicated. He's more focused on improving the railroad than pretty much anyone around him. And within a few years, when he's 39 years old, he's invited to become the vice president of the Illinois Central. So his management of the Illinois Central also, late 1800s, 1893, there was this panic that's not very well known today. I think you and I know about it, and some economists know about it. But there's this panic, and it's pretty well known today. This was caused by the government's silver policy, which is, we don't have to get into the details of it, but you could basically, in various cases, they incentivize the buying of silver over gold and gold over silver, and it caused this huge gold shortage in the United States and this huge panic, and tens of thousands of businesses closed, 500 plus banks closed, and caused this massive panic throughout the US. And Harriman was able to steer the Illinois Central through that without, not completely unscathed, but able to get them through without bankruptcy, and lots of other railroads would go bankrupt throughout the course of this panic, which stretched to about 1897.
Right. Harriman, the people who are known today from the inventive period, or popularly known as the Gilded Age, but I renamed it the inventive period in the Capitalist Manifesto. Yeah, I think it's fitting, it's appropriate. But James J. Hill, widely recognized as a great railroad man of that era. Slightly before that, one of the real pioneers of railroading was Cornelius Vanderbilt, known as Commodore Vanderbilt, whose son William Vanderbilt built Grand Central Terminal in New York City for the New York City terminus for the New York Central Railroad. But Edward H. Harriman is the equal of James J. Hill. He is one of the greatest railroad men of history, and what he does with the Union Pacific is just, and then the Central Pacific and the Southern Pacific is just extraordinary. I mean, Hill in the 1880s had built the Great Northern from Minneapolis, St. Paul to Seattle. Done it on private money, not with government subsidies. And Hill is a giant, as a great railroad man. Ayn Rand talks about him in her nonfiction. Perhaps Nathaniel Taggart, Dagny Taggart's ancestor, is modeled after James J. Hill. And Hill is a giant, and he's somebody we'll do on the on the Hero Show. Again, I know that no, John. I know there's people. I go off on tangents. I know there's some of you viewers may not like it. Some of our viewers love it. But when we discuss Hill, I just have to say his chief engineer was a guy named John Stevens, who was also a giant. We'll discuss him, who was not only instrumental in building the Great Northern, but also in building the Panama Canal years later. But as they said, it's another story for another day. Hill built very efficiently, the lowest grades possible, minimize curvatures, minimize waste, like Rockefeller and Carnegie, who we discussed on the Hero Show. He was a great enemy of waste, a tremendous supporter of efficiency. Hill was the paragon of the American belief that bigger is better. The biggest, most powerful locomotives, to be able to pull, these enormous freight trains of, 100 cars or, whatever. And Harriman learned that lesson from Hill, and he rebuilt. He rebuilt these lines. What was the Union Pacific? Its reputation was that it was just a rusted streak of iron.
Yeah.
It had been built with government money, and the people who built it were more concerned to get the money, make the initial killing, get government from the money, than build an efficient railroad that would make money over the long run. Yep. Well, Harriman changed all of that. When he acquired the Union Pacific, late 1890s, he put together a special train with an observation car in the front. Yeah. And the locomotive pushing it from the rear, and he went slowly from Kansas City, the whole length of the track, to Portland, Oregon, and back again to Omaha, Nebraska, stopping frequently to examine the track, to ask questions and so on. I said by the time Harriman got back to Omaha, he knew the Union Pacific Railroad better than any man on earth.
Yeah. One superintendent said that he saw every poor tie, blistered rail, and loose bolt. And people thought that he was crazy because he had just got this railroad. It had gone bankrupt in 1897, and he comes in as director. And so he's going to scour this thing, every inch of the track from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean, traveling. He's traveling only during the daylight hours so you could see everything. Very tedious, long, arduous journey.
Thousands of miles from Kansas City to Portland to back to Omaha. That's a schlep, as they say.
And many people thought that the Union Pacific just couldn't be profitable, and they thought he was crazy to want to plow all this money into it. But it's exactly what he did. He went through and he fixed everything, every little bolt and tie. He replaced hundreds of obsolete locomotives and added train cars. And how many thousands of miles of new heavy steel track did he lay?
Many. I don't remember.
42,000 or something.
Yeah. Well, he did that with Union Pacific. He took control of the Central Pacific and the Southern Pacific, which also had been built very sloppily, very inefficiently. He renovated them, eliminating the steep grades as much as possible, eliminating the curvature as much as possible, making the line very efficient. Those lines very efficient on the James J. Hill model. Building, bringing in the most powerful locomotives and the huge freight cars. Bigger is better. And then his lines in the West rivaled James J. Hill's Great Northern, and of course, Hill and Morgan took control of the Northern Pacific. So these guys were great rivals, although serving different parts of the country. Harriman's lines were well to the south of Hill's, but still, helping to in both cases. Well, we can leave Hill for a later show, but helping certainly to develop the western part of the United States. The freight traffic became, and passenger traffic too became, much more readily available, but freight traffic became much more efficient, and helping businesses, industries, and farmlands along the way. I think it was with the farmlands adjacent to or near to the Union Pacific track tripled, I think, in value. because of how well certainly they increase in value enormously. I think they tripled because now they have reliable freight service to be able to ship, agricultural goods to market in all different parts of the country.
Yeah, between 1898 and 1909, when Harriman passed, he more than doubled the tonnage of freight shipped on his lines. It went from something like 500,000 tons per mile of track to over 1 million tons of track. And I think we should take a minute to hammer on this distinction between the different approaches taken by different railroad men at this time. Perhaps there's some reason for people to call this the Gilded Age for its cronyism to some extent. I mean, this is another instance. We talked a minute ago about the government's silver policy and how that impacted and really caused the Panic of 1893. Well, another potential cause is the overvaluation of many railroads due to improper government involvement in the creation of the railroads in the U.S. The government was granting land and subsidizing the creation of many, many railroads. They wanted to see the country connected from east to west. And unfortunately, this was a really bad means of doing it, because what it did is it incentivized a lot of people that weren't really interested in starting long-term businesses and seeing them through and creating actual value, incentivizing those people to take these loans and get this land and make a quick buck by just putting down shoddy track, very poorly laid, using terrible materials, not getting very good engines to run on them, and taking this very short range approach. And the Hills and the Harrimans and the Vanderbilts of the era, no, they looked at, okay, what's the long-term goal here? It's to create real value and to create a consistent means of profiting. And one of the incredible things about Harriman, I think you talk about this in Catman, the Capitalist Manifesto, is that he had this even longer term vision of creating transportation across the globe, which is just incredible. He died so young at 61 of stomach cancer. If he hadn't, it's just incredible to think about what he would have achieved, because he had this long-term, profit-minded, value creation approach to transportation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The little giant, as he was known, as you pointed out, he thinks big, and the Worldwide Transportation Company. He had the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States. He had the steamship companies to, traverse the oceans, and he was in the process of buying or building trans-Asian railroads that would culminate in the Baltic ports of Northern Europe. And then he'd have an around the world transportation network early in the 20th century. I mean, that was just extraordinary, and it was huge. But like you said, unfortunately, he died young and was not able to complete that project. But talk about thinking big, He's like the Elon Musk of his day, or maybe Elon Musk could be the E.H. Harriman of our day. Although Elon Musk is a very mixed case, but SpaceX,
or the Jeff Bezos, given especially that they both had early careers in finance.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
I mean, transportation. Elon Musk, we're going to Mars.
Right. But people are not going to remember Jeff Bezos for his career, very successful career, as I understand it, in finance, and they're not going to remember E.H. Harriman. They're going to remember him for anything. It's going to be for his exploits in transportation.
Yeah, absolutely. In railroading, so he builds the the Union Pacific, the Central Pacific, the Southern Pacific into enormously efficient and productive lines. They're shipping vastly more freight, now after several years of Harriman's tenure. They're lowering freight costs, helping build businesses and develop, farmlands in the western part of the United States. And Harriman, was a tough guy to work for. There's a great quote from him, John, where he says, quote, "Cooperation means do as I say and do it damn quick." He was a can-do guy, and if you were going to work for him, you had to be equally can do. You had to get the job done. And there's a number of great stories about Harriman, his role in rebuilding San Francisco after the earthquake and fire devastated it in 1906. His role in quelling what they called the Runaway River, the Colorado River that was flooding the Imperial Valley in California right at the same time. And so we need to discuss the way Harriman used his lines to enormously beneficial advantage. So
Absolutely.
I guess we should start with the San Francisco earthquake and fire, shouldn't we?
Yeah. April 18th, 1906, one of the worst earthquakes in American history. And also, I think in terms of destruction and loss of life, one of the worst in world history. The Richter scale wasn't invented yet, but they look back on it and say that it was probably about a 7.8 on the Richter scale. Damaged, destroyed 80% of San Francisco, about 28,000 buildings, 3,000 lives were lost. And Harriman, as you well know, hears about this that afternoon of
we should
April
point out
18th.
that it precipitated the earthquake precipitated a fire, right?
It did.
That destroyed. What was it? Was it ruptured the gas lines? Perhaps I don't remember the cause of it, but precipitated a fire that destroyed a great part of San Francisco. I think I could be wrong with this, but I think the fire destroyed, triggered by the earthquake, destroyed more property than even the earthquake itself.
I think you're right. Yeah, it smoldered for like 3 days and nights.
Wow. Wow. And this is in the 20th century. This isn't 16th century where we have all these thatched roofs and no advanced firefighting techniques. So yeah,
Right.
that's a brutal fight. But I'm sorry, so you say, so Harriman's in his New York office and he hears about it, and then what?
Yeah, then what? So he flies into action immediately, right?
Yeah, he does. He barrels across the following morning. He gets on a train, and he barrels across the continent to San Francisco, and he takes charge of a great deal of the recovery operations. He uses his railroads to tremendous advantage. He has his lines bringing in food, like tens of thousands of dollars worth of food. He's get refugees who have no place to go. Their homes have been burned. He has trains carrying them to different parts of the country where they have family or friends, that they can stay with. There's a number of people who've claimed that San Francisco was able to recover from these twin disasters as quickly as it did, largely because of Harriman's efforts with his railroads.
That's right. I mean, these people didn't have food, they didn't have medical supplies, they didn't have a place to live. And immediately he put all the resources of his railroads at the disposal of the relief effort. Like you said, he goes out there to direct this railroad-centered relief effort. Gives away something like $1 million in free transportation to get people, these, I guess, earthquake refugees, to places where they can find housing. And so, yeah, they don't even go a single day in San Francisco without food, which is just incredible, this response.
Right. It is, let me quote something here
Please.
Like I said, just happened to have a copy here of the Capitalist Manifesto. Of course, that's by accident. That's by accident, Sean. But here, where is that? Within 24 hours I'll just read from the start. From the moment Harriman received word of the catastrophe on the afternoon of the 18th, April 18th, he put all the resources of the Union Pacific and Southern Pacific at the service of the stricken city. He left his office in New York the following morning and sped to the Bay Area to take personal charge of rescue efforts. Within 24 hours of the disaster, his railroad bought, delivered, and distributed $20,000 worth of food. Within 24 hours, that is really efficient. Bought, delivered, and distributed $20,000 worth of food. As a result, the burned out inhabitants of the city were not compelled to go hungry even for a single day. Further, his lines carried scores of thousands of survivors to nearby towns or to their relatives in the East, where the necessities of life were plentiful. By Harriman's orders, relief trains and refugee trains were given right of way over all other traffic, and all told, his railroads provided San Franciscans with roughly $1 million worth of emergency rail service. This is typical of Harriman. He was utterly undaunted by the massive damage. Like you, John, he's dauntless. After all, he was spending more on the reconstruction of his lines. He spent like $400 million to reconstruct his lines than the $325 million necessary to rebuild the city. And Harriman was relentless in his spirited and infectious optimism regarding the city's rebirth. Several years later, Railway World magazine made this point succinctly in an editorial, quote, "When San Francisco was laid in ashes, it was Mr. Harriman who took personal charge of the situation. His railroads rushed supplies into the city and carried thousands of refugees away from the city without charge for either service. It was primarily due to his organizing genius and energy that San Francisco rallied so quickly from its great disaster," unquote, from Railway World. So we see the benevolence here, the goodwill of this tough guy, but also maybe even more saliently, the can-do spirit, the can-do ability, and the relentless optimism regarding our abilities to build, to rebuild, to grow, to recover, to respond to disasters. He's like an Ayn Rand hero. He's like a character out of Atlas Shrugged. This is the way Dagny Taggart would have done it.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and this wasn't going to be the last natural disaster he had to deal with, not even that month. Right. This is the most amazing part. What was it? A couple of weeks later, in late April, the Colorado River breaks its bounds and starts flooding the Imperial Valley in California, threatening the livelihoods of all of these farmers and also about 60 miles of track of his railroad.
Yep. Well, and before we move from the northern disaster, we say from Harriman's response to the northern disaster to his response to the southern disaster, let me just say something about what Railway World had said, because they point out that he did all of this free of charge. So I just want to comment on that as a good objectivist. I added, one might disagree with only one part of this assessment. For the great capitalist was paid in future business, in goodwill, and in the pride derived from a construction project, indeed a Herculean labor superbly performed and beneficial to all parties. And I think this is worth discussing about the different forms of being paid or repaid, there's the trader principle. I spoke on this at TOSCON a couple of years ago. The trader principle. First of all, materially, the goodwill that Harriman any business generates when you do this will contribute to future patronage by the part of customers. People remember that, and I think this certainly helped generate future business for Harriman. But that's one way, of being repaid for the enormous benevolent and productive efforts. But also the pride of it. Not all forms of payments are monetary. You also get a lot of legitimate gratitude from honest people who are enormously grateful for what the help that you provided them, but also the inwardness of it, the pride in that this is the right thing to do. Human life is the standard of moral value, and this is that's why we run to the aid of innocent people, and to do it superbly like that. There's got to be a tremendous amount of pride, as an inner reward.
You could probably speak to this better than I could, but I recall something from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics where he talks about magnificence and this ability and willingness to give large amounts in these cases when doing so adds to your own pride, your own character, right, and is part of the magnanimous man's toolbox, so to speak, his toolbox of virtue, I guess.
Yeah. And Aristotle writes on this beautifully, and it's I only I don't I don't read ancient Greek, John. It's Greek to me, but
Don't say.
I only read Aristotle in English translation. So we can ask some of our friends, Professor Carrie-Ann Biondi, for example, who's
Yeah.
an Aristotle scholar on this. But yeah, the I love the translation of the magnanimous man is a beautiful translation, but my favorite is the great soul man.
Mhm.
This is part of what it is, has greatness of soul that you have so much your inner wealth, and perhaps your outer wealth as well, but your inner wealth is so great you could give bountifully from this reservoir of inner riches, and it just adds to it because you have now achieved. I mean, Harriman has now achieved some. I mean, he comes to San Francisco and it's a burned out husk, and then, months later, or he only lived for another 3 years, but still, San Francisco was rebuilt. And he could look at it then and go, wow, look at this. Knowing internally how much, how enormously I contributed to this regrowth, to this rebuilding. This is that pride of it. That is certainly a form of getting paid. So, meanwhile, while he's in San Francisco in makeshift offices, in charge of the relief effort, like you said, the Colorado River is now bursting its bounds and flooding the Imperial Valley, which is a productive agricultural land. So let me again, if you don't mind, read something from Catman on, because I love this stuff. I mean, I'm such an inveterate hero worshiper. I just eat this stuff up. So, like you said, the river threatened to inundate the fertile agricultural lands of the Imperial Valley in California, drown 60 miles of Southern Pacific track, and so on. So, late April, one of Harriman's officers hurried to San Francisco to inform him of the magnitude of the impending disaster. Harriman's biographer describes the dramatic scene. Quote, Mr. Harriman was not a man to be daunted or rattled by a sudden and menacing emergency. There, in the bustle and confusion of temporary offices, with the ruins of San Francisco still smoking, with the facilities of his roads taxed to the utmost in carrying people away from the stricken city, end quote, with his railroads facing unknown financial demands in meeting the northern disaster, the little giant turned to squarely confront the southern danger. He pledged hundreds of thousands of dollars to fight the runaway river. And it was a titanic struggle because leading engineers, I mean, what was the river was the Colorado at this point was discharging more than 75,000 cubic feet of water per second, or 6 billion cubic feet every 24 hours. And the freshwater lake newly formed in the Imperial Valley rose at the rate of 7 inches per day over an area of 400 square miles. There were leading engineers who told Harriman, this can't be done.
Yeah.
This river can't be, dammed.
Yeah, and he would hear none of that. He'd heard it before. He'd heard people say, "Well, that's impossible," and he overcame it. And so he once again was not going to back down. And over several months, working round the clock, spending extreme amounts of money, they're able to build a rock-filled dam to hold the river back, keep it in check, and that held for a while. It bursts its bounds a little further south, I believe, and then Harriman gets his engineers to build a 20-mile levee along the side of the Colorado River to keep the water in check, and that worked.
Right. Yeah, we gotta love Harriman's spirit. Just this can-do spirit. He really is. When I was doing the research for the Capitalist Manifesto, I didn't know much about Harriman. I mean, I had heard a lot about Rockefeller and Carnegie and Morgan and Hill and everybody. I only knew a little about Harriman. I was reading this, in his biographers and stuff. And it just right away, I thought this is he's an Ayn Rand hero. This is his spirit. He's undaunted by any of these disasters. People telling him this can't be done. It's like Dagny Taggart, in Atlas Shrugged, that the leading the State Science Institute and people telling him, Reardon metal, can't withstand, the heavy freight traffic and so on. Dagny said no. She said no. Yes, it can. When somebody asks, what's going to hold this lightweight bridge up, when a barreling freight train crosses it, she says, my judgment. She's an engineer, and she knows, she sees with her own eyes, she understands with her own mind, and she knows it can be done. Harriman was like that in real life. This can be done. He rejects all of that, the naysaying and negativism of leading engineers, guys who aren't, losers, guys who, he said, no, and you're right. So here, let me read this. A month later, this is the second flood. In December of 1906, a new flood breached other defenses of the Imperial Valley, and it became clear that it was necessary to build a massive levee along the west bank of the river for a distance of at least 20 miles. And of course, Harriman achieves it. There's a couple of things I want to say, including to bring in President Theodore Roosevelt, who loathed Harriman. What do you call him? One of the malefactors of great wealth, I think, was a quote of Teddy Roosevelt towards Harriman. But we should mention the Lucin cutoff, across the Salt Lake. Because previously, it was several years before this, people told Harriman that couldn't be done. Like you said, there were previous instances of this in his career, because the land under the lake was quicksand, and it was it threatened at several points to just the trestles that had to be built was just sinking into the mud at the bottom of the Salt Lake. And Harriman poured a lot of money, he said, no, this can be done. And it was done, and it saved, when it was finally completed, at great expense, and state-of-the-art railroading. It did in time repay itself, because it shortened the trip by many miles, and reduced the grades, that the steep inclines in the mountains that the trains had to climb, and eliminated a great deal of curvature, and shortened the distance, and it paid for itself, in time. But again, it was Harriman's dauntless spirit, his can-do, approach, that this can be done. The human mind, the human ingenuity can conquer these obstacles. And who are we reminded of here?
Our friend Shackleton.
Yeah, how many times have we quoted the great Shackleton, who we did on the Hero Show, that obstacles are just things to be overcome? Well, Harriman, showed that in like 3 different instances, with the Lucin cutoff, the San Francisco earthquake fire relief effort, and then damming the runaway river, Colorado River, in the Imperial Valley. This is great stuff. This is the stuff of legends, John. This is why it's some kind of sin that Harriman's forgotten today. This is amazing stuff.
Yeah, and it's really, really indicative, or it tells you a lot about Roosevelt and his ilk, to look at a guy like Harriman, who, just in the first effort we talked about, he spent over $1 million. Was happy to do it, and drew enormous pride from having helped save San Francisco and rebuild it. And then with the Imperial Valley, another $3 million, never repaid by Congress for that. I don't even know that he looked for it, but this wasn't like, oh, well, this is something we need to do. We need to spend all this money or save our railroad. What I gather, it was a pretty minor operation in that part of the country.
Yeah, it's agriculture. There's not a lot of money to be made in shipping, agriculture products. The money, freight traffic, is paid for, in industry. So this was not. You're right. This is not a big part of their income. Yeah.
And then you have Teddy Roosevelt, morally damning him,
yes,
for being this wealthy menace, when in fact he was a far greater benefactor to his countrymen than Theodore Roosevelt could claim to be.
Yeah. Yeah, and we should mention some of this. What did Roosevelt call one of the worst? I forget the exact quote. Malefactor. That was malefactors of great wealth. Now, Teddy Roosevelt to me is a very mixed case. He does a lot of good things about him, and I'm going to go off on a tangent here, John, and everybody. But this is stuff. This is stuff that I think is really important. In fact, right after 9/11. And I was thinking to myself, well, who would I want as president of the United States right now if I had my choice? And immediately came, I'd want Teddy Roosevelt because he would just go and he'd smoke our enemies. I mean, he would just wipe them out in the Middle East. And I was talking to some of my objectivist buddies. They said, yeah, Teddy Roosevelt would, but then, he'd want to colonize the Middle East. I said, well, you take the bitter with the sweet, but he certainly would have laid waste. He would have used the full might of the U.S. military to lay waste to our enemies. But at the same time, yeah, I mean, he was anti-capitalist, trust-busting president. He's the guy who initiated the breakup of Northern Securities, and we'll come back to that because that's another great Harriman story when he barrels into when he tries to wrest away control of the Northern Pacific Railroad from James J. Hill and J.P. Morgan, but Teddy Roosevelt's a trust buster. He didn't trust these big powerful companies, despite the fact that they were enormously efficient and they were lowering freight rates. Rockefeller was lowering the price of petroleum products. Carnegie was lowering the price of steel. Hill, Harriman are lowering freight rates through matchless efficiency and productivity, making possible building and growth, many different areas in the United States. Roosevelt is dead wrong, on this. So he's the bad guy here. And it was James J. Hill who said, after Roosevelt instigated breaking up the Northern Securities Trust, which is an enormously efficient railroad holding company. Hill, I think it was finally broken up. The Northern Securities was finally broken up by the Supreme Court, like 1903, 1904. Hill said something like, "It's really hard. We know how hard we've worked to build these lines, how efficient we've been." I'm not quoting him, but this was the words to his effect, and how we've lowered freight rates across across the West. Is really hard to in effect be broken up by these politicians who've never done anything but posture. Who've never done anything productive but posture, and of course, Hill's right. And the real sad part, John, is that one of those sad parts is that modern contemporary American historians, even really otherwise first-rate historians, mock Hill. There's this, he's a robber baron, and he's whining about these progressive businessmen who have the people's interest at heart. These Marxist anti-capitalist historians, but Hill was right. Hill was right in everything he said about that and about Roosevelt and these posturing politicians. You're right. Harriman. What Harriman did was vastly more beneficial to the lives of millions of Americans than anything Teddy Roosevelt ever did, in his domestic policies as president of the United States. So, yeah.
So why do we have this this saying today that Harriman feared neither God nor J.P. Morgan?
That is the greatest quote, isn't it?
Love it.
That is the greatest quote, which tells us as much about Morgan as it does about Harriman, right? It links Morgan to God, and we will discuss that with when we discuss J.P. Morgan. Okay, well, to answer your question, let's go back to Catman. All right. By the time he rebuilt the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific, the Southern Pacific, Harriman's roads amounted to some 25,000 miles of track by 1906, a true empire, all of which, by means of the same philosophy and methods of James J. Hill, he quickly built into lines to rival any in the nation. So, to answer your question, Harriman, combative to a fault, of whom it was said he feared neither God nor J.P. Morgan, came into Wall Street swinging after losing control of the valuable Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad to the Morgan Hill Group. Now Harriman was allied with Jacob Schiff, who was who was the head of the powerful Q and Loeb Bank, a Wall Street bank, the powerful Jewish bank. And I'm hoping, John, that Adam Schiff is not related to Jacob. He's not a descendant of Jacob Schiff, because Jacob Schiff was an enormously productive bank. Anyhow, in alliance with Jacob Schiff of Kuhn and Loeb, the powerful Jewish brokerage house to whom Morgan, an anti-Semitic upper-crust wasp, was unfailingly condescending, Harriman contrived a daring plan to purchase a controlling interest in the Northern Pacific and wrest it away from the Morgan Hill Empire. And with Morgan away on one of his many trips to Europe, Hill in Seattle became suspicious of the Northern Pacific's steadily rising price. Boarding a special train, he barreled across the continent and into the Wall Street offices of Kuhn and Loeb on the morning of May 3rd, 1901, to confront his old friend Jacob Schiff. These guys are giants, John. This is the stuff of legends, The resulting stock war shot the price of Northern Pacific to astronomical heights and threatened to ruin numerous brokers and speculators who had sought to sell NP stock short. When the smoke of the high-stakes shootout cleared, Morgan and Hill held a decisive advantage, but Harriman had clawed out a substantial position as a minority owner. The result, on Hill's insistence, was Morgan's formation of the monumental Northern Securities Trust, a gigantic holding company that enabled Hill, its president, to consolidate under one unified and cost-efficient management the three roads he owned. Several of Morgan's colleagues, as well as Harriman and Schiff, sat on its board of directors. So I don't think that's where, I don't know if that's where Harriman derived that reputation as being afraid of neither God nor J.P. Morgan. It might be where it's derived from, but he showed it in action that he wasn't afraid to take on the mighty J.P.
That's a great story.
Yeah,
it tells you a lot about his personality. I mean, he came from nothing, right? His father was a minister, I believe, and not very wealthy, but like we said, he got into banking young, built a solid foundation from there, foundation that enabled him to spend a lot of money buying a railroad and revitalizing it.
Yes.
And so it's just really interesting to see him coming from nothing. I believe J.P. Morgan, he came from a banking family. And so this was the family business, several generations culminating in this incredible financier who we'll definitely discuss in the future.
Yeah, but, definitely. He was Morgan, like Francisco d'Anconia was the climax of the d'Anconias. Yeah. We could argue that J.P. Morgan was the climax of the Morgans. Definitely patrician family, definitely upper crust, upper class, bulwark of the Episcopalian Church. Yeah, Morgan was definitely upper class, and yeah, right. Harriman came from a poor family and carved this out by means of his own genius and his own incredible industriousness and that just infectious optimism and can-do spirit of the man, of the little giant. I want to go off on a little bit of a tangent here about Harriman in popular culture. Was there any more points you wanted to make about Harriman himself?
No, please.
This is good stuff. For anybody who's seen the film Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and if you haven't seen it, see it. I mean, see it yesterday. And this is an absolute Hollywood classic. I think it was 1969. 1970, Paul Newman, a very young Robert Redford, who then went on a few years later to make The Sting. It's another classic that everybody should see. I don't want to give away too much. If you haven't seen Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, I strongly recommend it. But without giving away too much of the story, it's based on some history. The Hole in the Wall gang, these guys, these robbers, who bank robbers and train robbers, and they're holding up Harriman's trains. he's mentioned he's mentioned in the movie. This train or something. One of the employees. This is the union. This I think is Union Pacific. One of the employees, said this safe or this money belongs to Mr. Edward H. Harriman. And he's mentioned in the movie. Anyhow, so you don't hold the part of the takeaway here, John, and everybody's, you do not hold up the trains of Edward H. Harriman with impunity, because he got to the point where he was fed up with these guys, holding up his trains out there in the wilds, of the mountains in the West, and he hired, the Pinkertons, who were famous detectives at that time, to hunt them down wherever they went, and Butch and Sundance was married. I forget his wife's name, but she was a great marksman herself. They were smart criminals, and they took their money. They lived large for a while in New York City. Then they boarded a steamship. They went to South America. They owned property, in the southern part, in Patagonia. You're down in the most southernmost part of Argentina. And Harriman stayed after them. He had the Pinkertons hunting them down at the ends of the earth. He was gonna get these guys. And I won't say any more about that, because if you haven't seen Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, you want to see the end of the movie is roughly accurate, in terms of real life. Anyway, Harriman does a guy like Edward H. Harriman, the Little Giant, John, did not take kindly to no matter how affable these bank robbers and train robbers were. You're not going to hold up E.H. Harriman's trains, and he hired law enforcement to hunt them to the edge of the earth. So that's one great true story here. But the other, I don't know. I don't know if people are familiar with the novels of Frank Spearman, and the short stories of Frank Spearman. And I know about it because our friend Fred Weiss at the Paper Tiger reissued some of Spearman's books in the mid to late 1990s, and wanted me to review them, which I did for the old intellectual activist. I think Rob Trasinski was editing it. Then I read a bunch of Spearman's books. Now, by the way, one of them, a novel by the name of Whispering Smith, was a Western, made into a movie a number of times. One of them I vaguely remember seeing as a kid with Alan Ladd, who played Shane, by the way, in the Shane movie. Whispering Smith is kind of comparable to Shane. It's a terrific Western. But I bring this up because Frank Spearman lived in Nebraska, turn of the 20th century. And he's writing about a fictional version of the Union Pacific Railroad. I don't know if Ayn Rand was familiar with Spearman's books or not, but she loved a different book, Calumet K, which was about this enormously productive guy, and if I remember correctly, construction brain silos. Well, Spearman's books are of the same ilk. The guys who run this fictional railroad, this is the modeled after Harriman's Union Pacific. You talk about can do. I mean, floods are wiping away bridges and stuff, and rustlers and thieves are raiding the trains, and Spearman's hero is just they take care of it. They put an end to it. They address it. They build. They rebuild. They are simply indomitable. And if Ayn Rand didn't know about it, she would have loved it if she had read those books. The fictional characters, in Spearman's universe, Held for Orders, I remember, is the title of one of his collection of short stories. The Nerve of Foley, I think, is the title of another collection of Spearman short stories. I strongly recommend anybody who loves the stories of can-do business heroes was going to love reading Spearman's railroad stories and novels. They're modeled after Harriman's Union Pacific. Definitely so.
I'll have to find some of those. I've not read any Spearman. That sounds very interesting.
Yeah, I looked last night. I have some copies, some of the old Paper Tiger copies that Fred Weiss gave to me back in the day, for reviewing them. for him. But I looked last night; they're available on Amazon. They're in independently, create space
Mm.
publishing. That's Amazon's platform, right?
Yeah.
Create space, I think it's so. So I don't know how. Um, I don't know, the quality of the books themselves, how it's going to look or appear, or the words on the page. But I know the content of the stories is very good, and again, definitely modeled on the way Harriman, that can-do spirit with which Harriman ran, and his guys ran the Union Pacific, Central Pacific, and Southern Pacific railroads.
Well, my takeaway for Harriman, this is a beautiful quote. He said, it's never safe to look into the future with eyes of fear.
He was fearless. I mean, he was the little giant. He was a productive giant. I mean, I guess, John, we can end where we began. Harriman's fate has been even more cruel than Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan Hill, who've been vilified as the robber barons. He's been forgotten, and that's we have to do what we can to remediate that situation. Harriman's a giant, a productive giant, should be remembered as such, and I think we can close on that. I think, John, we can salute the productive genius and the can-do spirit of the great Edward H. Harriman. And we need more of that in the country today. Could you imagine Harriman's response to President Obama? Now, if you're an entrepreneur, you didn't build that.
Yeah.
Harriman, who feared neither God nor J.P. Morgan, I don't think would have feared Obama. He would have said, "Yes, I did."
Absolutely.
So, I want to wish everybody have a more heroic day, and for all of us, me, you, and everybody, to do our best to lead a more heroic life. So have a great day, everybody out there in Hero Land.